Thank you for joining us for this evening's Artists and Inspiration program, jointly presented by the Adirondack Diversity Initiative and the Adirondack Experience. My name is Nikki Hilton Patterson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, where we work together with our community partners to make the Adirondacks a more welcoming and inclusive place for all New Yorkers and its visitors, while cultivating an entire generation of environmental stewards from amongst Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities. Before we begin, I would like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that ADI's home office is on Wabanaki and Abenaki lands, and the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and life ways. Both ADI and ADKX are thrilled to continue our tradition of collaboration with tonight's presentation, Taking Their Place, bringing American women artists into the foreground, as part of ADKX's monthly Artists and Inspiration series. This evening's speaker is Professor Laura Prieto. Dr. Prieto is the Alumni Chair in Public Humanities and a professor of history at Simmons University in Boston, where she has been a faculty since 1997. She earned her BA from Wellesley, yay, a sister college, and her master's and PhD both from Brown University. Her first book, At Home in the Studio, The Professionalization of Women Artists in America, studies how women painters, sculptors, and illustrators created a professional identity for themselves in the face of exclusion. Her current research traces women's transnational work and activism within and across the overseas empire that the United States established in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Throughout this evening's presentation, I want to remind you, please feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Prieto, it is such a pleasure to have you here today. Please welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Nikki, and happy Women's History Month to everyone. I'm really grateful to the Adirondack Experience, especially to Cheryl Bronstein for inviting me to speak tonight, and many thanks to all of you in the audience for making time for this program. I'd like to add my own land acknowledgements since I am coming to you from a different place. I am speaking from Rhode Island, the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett, Nahantic, Nipmuc, Pequot, and Wampanoag nations. And I acknowledge with humility and respect how carefully those nations today and their ancestors for centuries have stewarded these lands despite their dispossession by settler colonialism. I hope you will join me in recognizing our ongoing responsibility to understand the legacy of this history and to respond to it with action working together. I'm going to share my screen. And it's my pleasure today to be giving this talk in conjunction with the exhibition Artists and Inspiration in the Wild, gathering art and design that capture the grandeur and adventure associated with the wilderness. From my conversations with the curators, commendably, this exhibit includes the work of a variety of women artists, including several around whom I shaped my talk today. But it is still a reality that most museums, including the Adirondack Experience, do not have much work by women artists in their fine arts collections. And the work by women artists they do have is mostly from the mid-20th century or after. I'm here to talk about how this is not because women did not make much art before the mid-20th century. On the contrary, women artists were, I'd say, ubiquitous in 19th century America. So why then don't we see more of their work and know more about them now? Tonight, I'll be talking about the challenges that women faced as artists from the era of the Civil War through the New Deal, as well as the strategies that they pursued to overcome those challenges. And I'm going to highlight 4 women whose art captured the Adirondacks in particular, all of whom have paintings in Into the Wild. Those are Kate Newhall, Edna West Teal, Edith Wilkinson Cook, and Amy Jones. Some of their life stories are not well known or even well documented, but there is still a lot to learn about them and through them about women's history in the arts. Let's begin with landscape painter Kate Catherine Newhall. This is her painting of Whiteface Mountain from Mirror Lake, which is in Lake Placid. The peak encircled by clouds instead of ski trails as it is today, and we'll come back to skiing later. The reflection of the mountain in the gently rippled waters makes this a serene contemplative scene. A single boat cuts across the reflection and gives us a sense of human scale. Newhall gives us a view of nature that's tamer than how the earlier Hudson River School painters might have presented it, but it's still majestic, dreamily beautiful as bright fall colors pierce through the haze. It's not an image that may prompt you to think about the artist's gender or gender at all, but like other women artists, Newhall could not afford to ignore what illustrator Alice Barber Stevens called the belittling prejudices against women artists. If we look a little closer, we'll see that Newhall signed this painting, as she signed other paintings, as K.W. Newhall, not Kate W. This was, of course, a tactic used not only in her century, but still to make a name genderless, and not only used by artists, of course, either. Newhall knew that most art critics and buyers were dismissive of women artists, and that even praise often had a double edge of condescension, describing a woman painter's brushstrokes or palette as delicate, for instance. So she chose to disguise, at least in terms of her signature, her gender. But the gender that Newhall's signature hid, her painting's details hint at. And I don't mean that in the sense of delicate brushstrokes. I mean that if we zoomed in, and I've pulled out this detail from the painting, it's evident that Newhall's tiny canoe in the shadow of the mountain has two women sitting in it on opposite ends. The women balance the man in the middle who is paddling them across Mirror Lake. Those women depend on the pilot to reach the other shore, but at the same time, they are independent of him. They are unconcerned with him. One woman seems more, let's say, decorative, wearing a fancy hat. She gazes ahead, as Newhall might have gazed at the scene. And the other woman looks down, maybe as Newhall looked down in sketching. These two women are not obviously the subject of the painting, but they are quietly present, perhaps even stand-ins for Newhall herself, and they put a woman's perspective into the painting, even though they are not in the foreground. Whiteface Mountain was just one of many landscapes that Newhall painted in her prolific career. Here is an earlier one, Autumn on the Black Brook from 1876. Newhall covered a lot of ground, literally. She was born in Fall River, Massachusetts in 1840, raised in New England. And then in the 1860s, she went to New York to study painting. She lived in culturally vibrant Brooklyn, later in Plainfield, New Jersey. And in the 1870s, her education complete, her art career begun, she ventured to California, where she ended up spending most of her life. She was, in fact, probably living in Redlands, California when she painted Autumn on the Black Brook. And she had had a studio in Berkeley, California for over a decade before painting Whiteface Mountain that we just looked at. Although Bay Area scenes dominated her work, Newhall continued to turn her eye to the Adirondacks and New England throughout her career. She supported herself economically through this art to the end of her life, remarkable in her accomplishments, but not, I'd say, unique. Newhall's paintings are in museums and in private collections, but there is almost nothing written about her beyond brief biographies in exhibition catalogs and auction catalogs. This was indeed the state of things for the vast majority of women artists, whether professional or amateur, successful or unacclaimed. A change began in the 1970s with the rise of a feminist art movement and researchers like Linda Nochlin, who started asking new questions. Nochlin was especially important. Her now famous essay, the tongue-in-cheek "Why Have There Been No Great Female Artists?" founded a whole field in 1971. And Nochlin persuasively showed how the deck was stacked against women meeting the biased standards of greatness. For instance, the nude subject was considered central to artistic development and achievement, but women were specifically prohibited from life study and anatomy classes in the 19th century because social standards deemed it inappropriate for respectable women to view naked models. This kept women from learning how to draw realistic human figures. Many art schools denied women admission outright to any classes on account of their sex. So did many artists' associations, which provided an important route to organized exhibitions, to potential patrons, and to networking with other artists. The Boston Art Club and the Cincinnati Art Club, to cite two examples, prohibited women from joining. In fact, even the rental of a studio threatened to compromise a woman's virtue by 19th century moral standards. And travel posed similar challenges, even for the privileged few who could afford it. Women socialized in public to hunt for husbands. It was another thing entirely to seek out men as colleagues and as collaborators. By the prevailing wisdom, women were properly the objects, not the makers of art. That is why Pierre-Auguste Renoir in the 1880s pronounced that the woman artist is merely ridiculous. Female models for male artists, that was the appropriate model, the appropriate order, of things. Women artists were caricatured as dilettantes, as this late 19th century trade card shows. The stereotyped lady amateur took art lessons because it was fashionable. She toured Europe, filling her sketchbooks with horrible drawings of colosseums and peasants. She dabbled at canvases and china plates alike in her mania for decoration. So a woman might be artistic, a dabbler with a feminine eye for color, but she was not an artist. She might have better spent her energies ornamenting herself, as this trade card suggests, and attracting a husband all the sooner. The women in Kate Newhall's generation who had artistic talent were thus largely confined to that dismissive designation of the amateur. For instance, very little is known about Cora Twining, who painted this Adirondack scene in the 1890s, which is part of the Adirondack Experience collections and in the Wild exhibit. It's unclear where Twining received training in art, though I'd say she clearly had skill, and her subject is ambitious. It's a group portrait of the important men in the small town of Copenhagen, New York. The school principal is depicted on the far left, the village doctor on the far right, storekeeper Charles Merrill, and the painter's ancestor, John S. Twining, in the middle. The lean-to shed and the tent mark them as pioneers, because Cora Twining was, in fact, illustrating the frontier history of her hometown with this portrait group. Its historical subject matter helps explain to me why her family may have kept it and why the Adirondack Museum acquired it, I believe, around 1971. The canvas is representative of the high level of ability that a woman might reach and yet remain an amateur. It is also a rarity in its survival, for many works, even by professional women artists of this period, are simply lost, overlooked and discarded by subsequent generations, even when their makers commanded respect against the odds during their lifetimes. It's interesting to note that Twining did not paint herself or any woman into her frontier scene. Perhaps she did not want to challenge the 19th century presumption that women belonged in the home. By middle-class dictate especially, women ought to be domestic, maternal, pious, and pure. Society needed them as angels whose nurturing care counterbalanced the public sphere, that is, the vicious impersonal world of business and politics. These domestic expectations pushed women out of many kinds of work that had seemed acceptable before. During the 1950s and 1960s, Adirondack folk painter Edna West Teal, remembered these social dictates, what women's historians call the cult of domesticity, when she looked back at her childhood in the 1880s. Teal's celebrated paintings depict scenes of everyday life on her family's farm near Lake Champlain. Her nostalgic reminiscences, published with her paintings in a well-known book called Adirondack Tales, some of you might know, they evoke a community and a culture in which women and men had distinctly different roles. Teal wrote that for her mother, quote, daily indoor duties, emphasis on the indoor, took practically all her time: 3 meals a day, the house to keep in order, the family sewing. Teal's mother, quote, made rugs and quilts and rag carpets, skimmed the milk daily, and seldom had help from the men with the 2 or 3 times a week churning and butter making. Throughout the day, Teal wrote, she would look out to see what the men were doing on the farm, for her house duties coincided with theirs. Coincided, but they did not overlap. Quote, mother was particular about a masculine and feminine division of duties, Teal noted. Teal's paintings likewise represent these tasks as deeply gendered. In her images, women's work is visually separate from men's, organically centered on home, family, and nurture. This domestic imperative seemed to leave little room for a woman to become an artist or any sort of professional. Yet Teal herself had had a career as a journalist, first as a reporter, then a feature writer and editor for the Newark Evening News in New Jersey. After her retirement is when she returned to rural New York and took up painting, watercolors, and then oils. She mounted her first solo exhibition in her 60s and published the innocent stories of her country childhood at that point. So for Teal, home was not a place of confinement and oppression. Who tended to the flowers on the sill? Who had painted the chairs such a cheery red? Indeed, her quiet, cozy, affectionate scenes suggest a creative spark and collective joy in women's domestic tasks, like drying apples. For many other American women, the supposed affinity between womanhood and artistic instincts proved to be an opportunity as well as an obstacle. Unlike law, medicine, and business, art was not regarded as simply men's work. As we saw earlier, the very stereotype of the lady dilettante rested on the notion that it was feminine to be artistic, that women's supposedly innate love for beauty and inherent talent for design naturally inclined them towards the visual arts. Artistic sensibility was an essential tool they relied on to create beautiful, comfortable homes for their families. To that end, 19th century women's magazines like Godey's Lady's Book regularly published instructions in decorative art. An educated taste and some knowledge of drawing were goals of 19th century girls' schooling as well. And drawing and painting became part of the curriculum early on at girls' academies, inadvertently giving young women a foundation in art on which they might build, and some did. As long as art making did not interfere with domestic duty, women could argue that it was simply an extension of the home's gentle, soothing, civilizing influence on the family, and through the family on society. Still life, flower painting, and domestic scenes provided unobjectionable subjects for women to draw, sketch, paint, and sculpt, and sometimes became the foundation of a woman's career in art as well. For instance, Anne Hall found critical and financial success in portrait miniatures, principally of children and of women. Hall became the first woman inducted into the National Academy of Design in 1833. Fun fact, almost half the women who exhibited at the Boston Athenaeum in its first 30 years exclusively showed portrait miniatures. Tellingly, Hall's contemporary William Dunlap compared her portraits of children to, quote, elegant and well-arranged bouquets of flowers. So I suppose there's a way we're supposed to think of these miniature portraits as also still life. Portraits and domestic scenes could have subversive elements, though. Lily Martin Spencer, for one, often injected humor into her paintings, like this one called Domestic Happiness. At first glance, it seems a simple, conventional depiction of an idealized young family. But the mother's gesture, gently holding back her husband from waking the sleeping cherubs, is a sly comment on what makes for domestic happiness, sleeping children, and who is best suited to preserve it, not the patriarch. The moral messaging expected of neoclassical sculpture enabled women to take their place in that genre as well, unlikely as it may sound. In fact, it could be argued that sculpture became the most inclusive medium for women artists, in that not only white women, like those I've been talking about so far, but a woman of color found singular prominence in it. Edmonia Lewis, of Ojibwe and Black parentage, was born in Rensselaer County, New York, learned weaving and moccasin making and other crafts from her mother's people, then more unexpectedly enrolled at Oberlin College, where she began to study fine art. Determined to become a sculptor, she cultivated patrons and commissions enough to work for most of her career in Italy. And her renowned pieces, like Hagar, often integrated biblical or literary subject matter along with racial themes and allusions. Women were also able to draw a line from still life and flower painting to landscape. They broadened their field of vision beyond the household and claimed all of nature as an apt subject for women. Women produced both fine art and commercial art that crossed the domestic threshold into the wild. Julie Hart Beers, for instance, followed her older brothers into landscape painting, literally followed them, for they discouraged her, but Beers wrote that she, quote, tramped on after them many a weary mile through mud and wet, sketching in the Hudson Valley and throughout New England. It's notable that as a 22-year-old widow, she supported herself and her two daughters through selling her work and by leading sketching trips in Vermont and the Adirondacks. While the exact location of this intimate study remains unknown, its small size and rapid brushwork suggests that it was likely painted in plein air, like much of the landscape painting of Beers and her contemporaries. Art won acceptance as a means by which women might even earn a living if necessary. That necessity and desire opened the door in turn to art education for women in the mid-19th century. The Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts began admitting women's students in 1844, almost 40 years after its founding in 1805. The National Academy of Design in New York followed suit soon after in 1846, which was over 2 decades after its founding in 1825. And one institution, the one photographed in this slide, the Cooper Union, was co-educational from its founding in 1859. Cooper Union's mission was to provide free education to the working classes, and it admitted women and men with no racial or religious restrictions. Cooper Union furthermore charged students according to what they could or could not pay. It's an understatement to say that all that was unusual for the time. In 1860, its second year of existence, Cooper Union hosted a National Women's Rights Convention, as well as Lincoln's famous speech. And that was the decade when Kate Newhall studied art there, earning first place certificates in still life and in oil painting. In this same generation, teaching increasingly open to women, well, if they were not married, and women prepared for that profession at new teacher training colleges where the student body was predominantly female. Teaching art, in fact, became another way for women to have a career in art, even if they struggled with their marginalization in galleries, exhibits, and on the art market. Soon, women artists began to gain access to life study through an ingenious compromise, the ladies' life class. This innovation started quietly at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in 1868 and soon spread to other American art schools. Segregated classes provided an atmosphere of propriety because it meant that men and women would not be simultaneously looking at a naked model. And schools simply did not hire male models to pose for ladies' life classes. These were no small considerations in an era when such exposure was not just considered embarrassing, but morally and sexually dangerous, especially for women. The ladies' life class could thus give women the chance to develop their technical skills without threatening to corrupt women in the eyes of society. Meanwhile, women artists created their own autonomous institutions and spaces, separate women's art clubs to nurture collegiality and mentorship, to mount their own exhibits, and to help sell their work. Separatism was a strategy to build solidarity, to confront their marginalization with a united front. Of course, training alone does not make an artist. Women continued to find inspiration both in the domestic sphere and in the wild. The new women emerging in the late 19th century strode confidently down city streets, marched in suffrage parades, and climbed mountains. Like Julie Hart Beers before her, Edith Wilkinson Cook began hiking in the White Mountains with her family. Soon young Edith was going on annual summer excursions to mountaineer with her close friend, fellow painter Susie Barstow. Like Kate Newhall's relationship with Leola Hall Coggins, Edith Cook and Susie Barstow's friendship sustained their work as artists. Cook's detailed autumn landscape shows an analogously intimate group. You'll see a little more clearly in this detail. 3 elegantly dressed women looking over a fence while walking along a woodland path. They are perfectly at ease in the wilderness, almost camouflaged, looking away from the viewer towards their own adventure and perhaps the scene that they will be sketching. By the way, although we are only now rediscovering landscapes like Edith Cook's, they were prized when she painted them, and this particular painting descended through Hudson River School artist Sanford Gifford's family. It may have been a gift from Cook to Sanford. Their shared enthusiasm for climbing art and botany led Cook, Barstow, and their companions to the Appalachian Mountain Club, organized in 1876 and the first of its kind. It was an organization that aimed to explore, map, study, and preserve the natural beauty of mountains. Clubs like these encouraged not only conservation, but outdoor recreation and tourism in areas, of course, including the Adirondacks. I also want to note that preservation, naturalist study, recreation, and tourism were elite pursuits. Club members were wealthy, well-educated, and well-connected. Women could find acceptance there as equals, but only from a shared position of privilege, including whiteness and class. Cook's contributions bridged art and science. She gave the Appalachian Mountain Club one of her paintings and enlivened its field meetings with her poetry. She also collected jack pine specimens at the top of Welch Mountain in New Hampshire and other biological samples. Her paintings reflected Cook's botanical knowledge, as well as her confidence and command of the landscape. Ledge overlooking mountains on this slide puts the viewer on height, gazing over, not up at the mountains. The elevated position of the overlook suggests ownership, a kind of dominion, the visual perspective that art historian Albert Boehme calls the magisterial gaze. Taking that point of view as a woman artist asserted a new mastery of the terrain in every sense. By the end of Cook's life in 1902, women artists' strategies had gained them a more secure place and expanded opportunities in their profession. Not only within the art world, but in American society at large, women had entered the public sphere that once excluded them. Their vibrant presence alongside men on dance floors, in classrooms, in factories and department stores, athletic fields, movie audiences, and even voting booths. These seem the ultimate sign that of modernity to contemporary observers, a decisive break from the Victorian past. Amy Jones's vibrant, joyful sketches from the 1930s capture the way even changes in fashion gave women greater mobility, making outdoor sports like skating and skiing more accessible. Cumbersome long skirts, clothing that weighed several pounds, had become a thing of the past. Less constricting clothing, including trousers, reflected less restrictive ideas about women's proper place. So although it is visually dramatically different from the art that I've been showing you in this talk until now, Jones's poster for the Lake Placid Club captures what earlier generations of women artists had hoped and reached for. With bold lines and colors, it puts a woman in the foreground. The skier's plucked eyebrows, curly lashes, and full lips are as feminine as Rosie the Riveter's, but her attire is also eminently practical. We're invited to wonder what she's thinking as she looks over her shoulder admiringly at a ski jumper. This infectious image was a commercial product, you'll note, designed to promote the club as a place where winter sports were exciting and fun for women too. It was probably part of the club's campaign to bring the Winter Olympics to Lake Placid in 1932, when 21 women indeed joined the 231 men as Olympic athletes. Only men competed as ski jumpers at that Olympics, but Jones's poster suggested that day would come for women too. At the same time, we should take care not to see this image or its historic moment as a triumph of equality. Not only because it took until 2014 for the Olympics to let women ski jump. As you may know, the Lake Placid Club prohibited Jewish or Black members or guests. It excluded anyone against whom even a small minority voiced a, quote, physical, moral, social, or race objection, close quote. And professional art itself remained a predominantly white field, remains, I could use present tense. So we have to qualify our claims of women's gradual inclusion by recognizing the limitations. It's important, not to conflate women's inclusion with what is only white women's inclusion. In some ways, much had changed for American women artists by the 1930s. Women were fully eligible for public art commissions under the New Deal, for instance. As Charlotte Striefer Rubinstein writes, this was perhaps the first time in world history, the 1930s, when women artists were hired without discrimination in proportions that related to their numbers in the population. Women worked as regional directors for federally funded art projects and agencies in this era. They also created thousands of easel paintings, prints, and sculptures, taught classes in government art centers, felt a great sense of camaraderie and equality with their male counterparts, as they testified in the writings that they've left behind. Probably Amy Jones's best known painting in the Adirondack Experience collection is St. Regis Reservation. In it, Jones depicts the intersections of traditional and modern life in the 1930s among the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, as they refer to themselves today. On the strength of this painting, Jones won her first major commission. The Federal Treasury Department selected her to paint a public mural for the post office in Winsted, Connecticut. A diverse, successful career as a painter, illustrator, and teacher followed. In the long tradition of white women painters and photographers who represented Native peoples in their art, Jones's St. Regis Reservation triptych broke from the conventions of content, framing, and pose typically used by men. Where her contemporaries usually pictured Indians as primitive, untouched by progress, the left panel shows a physician, possibly Mohawk himself, checking children on the reservation for tuberculosis. The middle panel has a Christian cemetery in the background of the logging scene. And while most New Deal art emphasized gender differences, especially around labor, Jones included Mohawk men and women weaving baskets. So I'd like to close my talk tonight with that theme of work gendered and shared, work connecting past and present, domestic and creative work. The work of feminist art history and women's history continues as well, not only in recovering forgotten lives, but in challenging the categories and boundaries that rendered women artists invisible in the first place. The work of valuing women artists needs to persist in multiple ways. 20th century women artists may be better represented on museum walls than their predecessors, but they are hardly equal. Today, women artists total just 2% of sales of fine art, and the average prices of women's work at auction are 40% lower than the average for art made by men. If there is ever to be decisive change, we also need to keep interrogating the assumptions that have made art so exclusionary for so long. I want to learn more about this pack basket from the Adirondack Experience collections and part of the In the Wild exhibit, not just as an object or an artifact, but as a work of art. Created by Neo Perkins, Haudenosaunee artist and designer, I want to learn more about the previous art and artists that this beautiful basket is in conversation with, Indigenous women artists in weaving and beadwork, artists who would not have been recognized in 19th or 20th century galleries, but whom we should recognize as artists. There is, a wider group of American women artists still waiting to be written back into history. So I'm excited to know that In the Wild embraces an expansive definition of art, making space for all kinds of women in the foreground. I look forward to the new questions it will raise and the stories that it will help us piece back together. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you so very much for that. Thank you to Nikki, who started us off this evening. I'm going to take your questions now, and we do have some questions in our chat. One comes in of, where does Georgia O'Keeffe's work fit into women Adirondack artists?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure whether O'Keeffe did any painting in the Adirondacks themselves. I don't know if the questions meant generationally or in the kind of the narrative that I spun out. She is more clearly towards the end of the story that I was telling, and definitely a standout. If there are maybe 2 or 3 names of women artists that the general public knows, O'Keeffe is one of them. So I think for a long time, what I would say about O'Keeffe is that for a long time, O'Keeffe has been touted as the exception to the rule, that even including her in the canon, as people refer to it, the great, accepting her as a great woman artist, did not really mean that there were other women artists. She seemed to be the exception that proved the rule. And she herself was, in a sense, conflicted about that. There were many statements that O'Keeffe made throughout her career where she resisted being labeled as a woman artist. She felt that was categorizing her in a really limited way, that she wanted to be regarded as an artist and not as a women artist. So there was that part of her work, but she also had very close relationships with other women artists. And so her career is also an example of that kind of mutual support and close friendships with Anita Pulitzer, for example. O'Keeffe was a supporter of rights and suffrage for women and breaking lots of barriers. To me, she not only represents the artistic genius that a woman could obviously embody, but also the kind of conflicts of what it meant to work with or against the conventions for women. She was very willing to break those conventions in her life and in her art. But I think she also benefited from some of the women's networks and women's spaces that I talked about today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have another question about painting, the size of paintings in the sense is there a difference in the size of painting the canvases between those of contemporaneous men and women artists? In the case of like, how large was Kate W. Newhall's painting of Whiteface Mountain, for example, and in relation to her male contemporaries?
Yeah, great question. To be perfectly honest, I've learned a lot about these particular women painters that from my talk since being invited to speak by the Adirondack Museum. The amount of writing that's been published and research that's been conducted on women as landscape painters is relatively new. So there's been a lot of rediscovery of this. And maybe I'm trying to read, there's some links in the chat that I'm not sure they're visible to everybody. I
don't believe they are. So
you don't believe they are. Okay. The multitasking of Zoom. I know that Whiteface Mountain is 12 by 20. Which is not like a monumental canvas, but a lot of the Hudson River School painters also, it varied small and large canvases. So I'm not sure what the direct answer to that question is about men and women and different sizes of canvases. I think they both painted in larger and smaller sizes.
Some information coming up in the chat now. So question is, O'Keefe did paint in Lake George.
Great. Thank you for that.
This question is, if women were formally educated in the arts, did they attend schools in the Hudson Valley? It appears that many artists share similar traits to artists from the Hudson Valley School.
Again, not sure. So by schools in the Hudson Valley, I'm not exactly sure what schools you had in mind with that question. Sorry, if I could get a clarification, maybe in the.
So we'll wait a moment for a clarification. Okay. Right now, that we don't have any open question. Vassar.
Oh, for example, at Vassar, yeah. So the women's colleges, of which there were a few at the time, did have art departments and art instruction. So that would have. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little lost here. My apologies. So they would have been able to study fine arts at those kinds of institutions, as well as the more specialized training schools that I talked about before.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. We got a clarification. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to wait to see if some more questions come in, and well, let's see. I'm going to tell you about next month. Thank you so much. I'm Christine Campos, School Programs Manager at the Adirondack Experience. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We're glad that you joined us, and in the summer of 2023, the Adirondack Experience will open a brand new experience for our visitors, Artists and Inspiration in the Wild. the first permanent exhibition dedicated to our art and design collection. And many of those works were exhibited in Dr. Prieto's program this evening. Well, we do have a question coming in. Was Margaretta Peel related to Charles William Peel?
She was indeed part of the Peel family of painters. She was the daughter of James Peel, and who was Charles Wilson Peel's brother. But the Peel family, interestingly enough, even though a lot of women in that family also became professional painters, along with, you know, men and their brothers, James Peel, Margaretta's father, did not learn to paint until afterwards, and he learned from his daughters. So even though it was sort of the family trade coming from an earlier, more kind of workshop model, artisanal model of painting, James sidestepped that for a while until his daughters became involved in the family business, and he learned miniature painting from them.
That's fascinating. Another question, in the 1800s, where would artists get their paints and their canvases? And their brushes, for that matter, yeah. And their brushes, for that matter.
The art product market was commercialized maybe a lot earlier than you would think. So already in already before the 1900s, in the 19th century, there would be commercial sales of, you know, some artists did grind their own paints, but one would buy canvases and paints at a store, as well as sketchbooks, as well as advice manuals for not only learning how to sketch and draw and paint, but also traveling for those privileged few I referred to who might be able to go to Europe to study. In fact, one of my favorite primary sources that if you're interested, you might want to look up, from 1879, one of the art manuals directed at women who wanted to become artists, called How to Study Art Abroad and Do It Cheaply, appeared in 1879, and the author of that manual was May Alcott, who was Louisa May Alcott's sister and also an artist. So that's in public domain now, and that is a really fun source from this era to read through.
Indeed. We have another comment in question. The information regarding pricing percentage and percentage of the market is very interesting. What is the entity or organization that tracks that kind of information?
There was recently a study done, and I can dig out and find a link in the chat or send it through all of you. There was an extensive NPR story from that appeared a couple of years ago that was tracking that information about art sales and about the percentage of women. There's also an activist group, which you may know, called the Guerrilla Girls, which emerged in the 1990s and has continued to be very active, which has the self-appointed mission of keeping museums honest when it comes to percentages of both women in collections and also artists of color in collections. And they do a lot of statistical information gathering, as well as what I'd call performance art in exposing it, public education campaigns. And I see a link up here in the chat about the Guerrilla Girls. Yeah, so that is another really good source of information. Unfortunately, their mission continues.
We've also received a number of thank yous in the Q&A. Many thank yous, fantastic information, wonderful presentation. Oh, this is an interesting comment. One of the women who started Guerrilla Girls lives in Keene Valley.
Wow. We don't know which one. They are anonymous, I think, still publicly, or they take on aliases as well as wearing gorilla masks. but neighbors.
Wow. Edna West Teal's book, Adirondack Tales, was a great read. Thank you for this talk. And
Thank
lots
you.
of thank yous. Wonderful talk are coming in. Thank you so much. I do want everyone to know that please join us next month when our Chief Curator, Laura Rice, will be in discussion with Smithsonian American Art Museum Senior Curator, Eleanor Harvey, about the connections between land and landscape paintings. And information and a registration link for that program is in the chat. The Adirondack Experience will open for our 2022 season on May 27th. And we hope to see you all on campus this summer. Laura, thank you so much again for this wonderful, fascinating presentation. Learned so much. A lot of great comments are coming in. So thank you so much for this evening. Very much appreciated. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all for the opportunity. I really appreciate you spending the time with this program, and I look forward to being able to visit in person when Adirondack Experience reopens with this fantastic new permanent exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good night, all.